Hello, today we're going to take a look at Chapter 21, the first section in the chapter, Japan as an Economic Superpower. So, as you recall, Japan was part of the Axis during the Second World War and was defeated, as you've already studied. And so, post World War II, they went on almost a miraculous economic recovery, but up until recently had not increased its military at all in response to the aggressiveness that they were guilty of during the Second World War. So let's take a look at modern day Japan quickly today in section 1. Uh, After the war, the the Empire of Japan, was occupied by the United States under the dictatorship of MacArthur. And surprisingly, his control during those 7 years were looked on favorably by the Japanese. Most of the Japanese people had realized that their emperor and the group of military generals who took over Japan in the 1930s and 40s had gone out of control with their aggressive nationalism, and they knew that they had to change, and they knew that they had been defeated, and that America was going to try to set up a free democratic society in Japan. Which those feelings still hold true today. If you were to travel to Japan, you will notice that they are very pro-United States. They're very friendly towards Americans, and they appreciate America's protection, particularly recently with the aggression of China. Japan is very dependent upon the United States pledge of defense. So that's where it is from now. Also, we see that there are Christians from our own Christian viewpoint in Japan, although it's a very difficult path because of the pagan religions of Shintoism that are prevalent in Japan, as well as Confucianism and Hinduism. So those are some of the main religions there. However, you do see some Christianity making headroads. There we see shortly before the occupation period the American General MacArthur and some of his staff. So the occupation was viewed favorably, as I mentioned, and Japan modernized very quickly. And Hiroshima, for example, after the devastating atomic bomb in August of 1945, by 1958 already it had recovered and was surpassing its production. So very incredible. So the reconstruction also was demonstrated in the 1964 Olympics that were held there in Tokyo, and they showcase many of the signs of industrialization, as you see from this copy of a booklet that I picked up in Japan on a trip there in 2003. The Japanese language, of course, is many of the ideograms are borrowed from China, just like much of the culture of Japan is borrowed from China. It's dominant culture in that region of the world, and tweaked and changed to fit the Japanese likes. They rely on kanji characters or symbols, which again is very different than our own phonetic language. Here you have the kanji characters for a few of the basic things. So as you can tell, it'd be very difficult for Americans to learn all these symbols, and as well it is difficult for Japanese children to learn all these and to paint the calligraphy with ink. So many hours are spent in Japanese schools practicing painting the right symbols. So there is some controversy today in Japan to go away from the symbols and to more of a alphabet. Many, of course, like we mentioned, are Hindu, Buddhist, or Shinto. There are some Confucianism from the influence of China. We visited some Shinto and Buddhist shrines to learn more about the local religion, and so I just inserted a few pictures from our trip there. They have a very high standard of living. Most of them, however, do live in what we would consider cramped quarters because of the large population on just a few major islands. This is what you call an Asian toilet, where you can see there's no seat, you just crouch over it. Many of the poor people would just have Asian toilets, although European style toilets are catching on there as well. Housing, like I said, is a challenge there. They also depend very much a little bit on the culture there, that you have to always take shoes off and put slippers on. Typical Japanese home. Students, of course, are under a lot of pressure in Japan to excel. There's a lot of competition. You don't want to shame your family, so there's a lot of emphasis on honor and on excelling and competition in academic circles to do well. So advanced education is one of the reasons for their boom. They do this, and here's some of the calligraphy I was mentioning earlier. The students in the elementary class busy working on that. We visited here several elementary classes where they work diligently on their calligraphy. There has been attempts to reform education recently, and there's a lot of stress on teachers in the public schools, similar to in America, to have the students excel on testing, and the teachers are under a lot of stress to get that done, and they work countless hours to try to reform and make the students reach those goals. Here is an article where a teacher was fired for not constantly improving. The term here is called Kaizen. I circled it here in this newspaper article. Kaizen is a Japanese phrase for constantly improving. It's worked its way into the vocabulary of the corporations of America today. Many corporations are emphasizing Kaizen, or constant improvement of their production or of their business. So that term was popularized during the educational reform in Japan, and now has become more and more popular in America. You probably have even heard of Kaizen. So that's the reform. Food is, again, Japanese food is very much emphasis on rice and seafood, as well as soups and lightly fried dishes of yakitori. Typical American breakfast, which is hard to come by in Japan, but then a typical Japanese would involve rice and some type of seafood or vegetables. Ramen, different noodles, even blowfish, as you see here. I took a picture next to these restaurants who are entitled to do those. Eels, octopus, many strange tasting concocted drinks are available in various kiosks around Tokyo. Yakitori is popular, lightly battered and fried vegetables and meats. In some places you kneel. This is a very common picture in Japanese. The businessmen go for lunch and they slurp these bowls of soup and then back to work again. They have very formal dress, as you can see, a typical school child here. Some Japanese still go all the way back to the kimonos, and this is more in Kyoto, the ancient capital city, which we also visited, but most Japanese would dress pretty much like an American teenager. So there are many different festivals. The main one, of course, is the tea ceremony, which we maybe could talk some more about. The tea ceremony, where a tea master actually brews the tea, and there's very strict regulations on how to participate. They're also very keen on little different characters, different cartoon faces. Even on business cards of executives, they'll have little floofy characters. And this is a popular cultural item that is now, again, there's a niche market in America for people who follow Japanese culture. They trade in these cards and so on. Maybe you've heard of that. So sometimes you'll see that kind of stuff. Kabuki theater and calligraphy is something else. The arts, taiko drumming is popular. It's very industrialized in Japan, as you probably could guess, with the development of motor vehicles, Suzuki's, Toyotas, Hondas. Toyota also became the biggest car manufacturer, surpassing even GM. So this has really been a factor. One of the main things we're going to be talking about with Japanese economy, though, is the 1990s, the so-called lost decade, where they had about 10 years of economic stagnation. So we're going to take a closer look at why that was and how they eventually worked out of it and how that might affect uh, worldwide economics. So after that, um, they had to reform their whole culture, their whole economics in order to recover. The fish markets, oh, and they're also very popular in Japan, are the bullet trains, the high-speed trains to take you from one place to another. We were able to ride a high-speed train from Tokyo to Kyoto. And of course, the subways are very efficient, very clean. They very work well. Many of the common things, in fact, some of the technology, higher end technology, mobile technologies are available in Japan prior to their release in America even. So that's one interesting thing that we noted. Here's, because of the lack of space, they built the Kansai airport out into the bay. So you actually land your airplane right there out, and then you take this bridge back to the mainland. They're also very environmentally concerned about having so many people packed on one island. They do have to recycle. They have to make every effort to use the resources they have. Their foreign policy, they are very nervous about North Korea. They're starting to get more nervous about the aggression of China and the disputes in some of the smaller islands. So these are some concerns. There are relations with China, as you can see here, but they depend largely on the U.S. for defense. And there are some efforts today for some Japanese to become rearmed. So the current leaders of Japan are considering beefing up their armaments and possibly even nuclear power, nuclear warheads, which seems odd because of the fact that the nuclear bombs were dropped on Japan. Most of the citizens are against developing any kind of nuclear weapon, although some are starting to realize maybe that would be a deterrent to the aggression of North Korea and China, which are next door neighbors and make Japan. Here you see Kotsumi, the previous premier of Japan with George W. They were close friends. In fact, George W. Bush invited him to the ranch, and they had a good time together and showed the close relationship of the Japanese and the American governments, but as well as the people too.